Hello, I'm Jan Szerwiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, on this episode, we're talking about Kazakhstan, the country that's usually a bit far from the global spotlight. Now, you might be wondering, why Kazakhstan? Well, it's a strategically located, resource-rich nation-state that has found itself at the epicenter of a geopolitical tug-of-war. On the one side, we have Russia, Kazakhstan's massive neighbor to the north, with whom it shares a long and, let's be honest, complicated history. On the other side, we have the West, looking at Kazakhstan like a potential partner in containing Russian influence. And also, there is another player lurking in the background. Guess who that is? Without further ado, let's take a look at our report to find out more.
Kazakhstan has been playing its cards wisely, operating in the shadow of Russia, a former empire, and reaping benefits from its ties with the West. The country has been balancing between the two powers, at times playing one against the other. Last month, Kazakhstan hosted the 24th meeting of the Council of Heads of State of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The steppe country has recently received 6 new Su-30SM multi-role fighters from Russia's Irkutsk aviation plant. Bearing the numbers 51 through 56, the aircraft replaces the older Soviet-era MiG-29 fighters, which have undergone decommissioning. The purchase came despite earlier prospects of a deal with France's Dassault Aviation. The French and Kazakh presidents visited each other in 2022. In spite of Macron's efforts, Kazakhstan ultimately announced in November last year it would turn to Russia's Su-30SM fighters. Astana surely can afford to beef up its military. The country's economy, as the last predictions show, is well poised to ride an upward curve in the coming years. The estimates are based, among others, on the International Monetary Fund's forecasts showing the global economy growing by 3.3% in 2025 and the oil price soaring to approximately €70 per barrel. Kazakhstan's economy is expected to grow in all sectors. The manufacturing industry could grow from 5.4% in 2025 to 6.6% in 2029. Oil production is forecast to rise from 97.2 million tons in 2025 to 104.8 million tons in 2029. Kazakhstan's mining industry is expected to grow 2.9% per annum, agriculture 5.3%, construction 9.3%, transport services 8.2%, and in trade 7.1%. It seems Kazakhstan is about to enter 5 years of rising prosperity.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Kazakhstan's current president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, is playing a very delicate game. He's trying to keep Moscow happy, because when your neighbor is a bear, you don't really poke it with a stick, at least not too much. But at the same time, he's also flirting with the West, talking about partnerships, investments, and all the things that make Putin's blood pressure spike. This balancing act may sound like a clever strategy, but let's not forget, if you stand in the middle of the road for too long, you're bound to get hit by a truck. An old rusty truck that, for some reason, has a hammer and sickle symbol on the front. But I hear you asking again, why is Kazakhstan so important? Well, we'll try to answer that for you. For starters, it is sitting on a mountain of resources, oil, gas, and uranium. And in the current global energy crunch, everyone wants a piece of that pie. Russia needs Kazakhstan's energy exports to keep its own economy afloat, especially as Western sanctions continue to bite. Meanwhile, the West sees Kazakhstan as a way to diversify energy supplies and reduce dependence on Russian oil and gas. But Tokayev isn't just sitting back and letting these two giants duke it out over his country. No, he is actively playing both sides against each other. On the one hand, he is reaffirming ties with Russia, making sure to keep the Kremlin from getting too paranoid about Kazakhstan's intentions. On the other hand, however, he is also strengthening relationship with Western countries, inviting foreign investment and even participating in joint military exercises with NATO. So let's talk about the Russian side of this equation. Putin is not thrilled with Kazakhstan's growing coziness with the West. In fact, he's downright suspicious. Remember, this is the same guy who invaded Ukraine because he felt NATO was getting too close for comfort. So imagine how he feels about Kazakhstan, a country that was once part of the Soviet Union, now getting friendly with the West. It's like watching your ex start dating your worst enemy. You're not just upset, you're plotting how to win them back, or at least make their life miserable. Russia has a long history of viewing Kazakhstan as part of its sphere of influence. And by sphere of influence, I mean they think of Kazakhstan like something they could have if they wanted to. So Putin is doing what Putin does best, applying pressure. It's the classic keep your friends close and your neighbors who you kind of want to control even closer type of strategy. And now to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, Central Asia Fellow, Foreign Policy Research Institute. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So we often delve into specifics of foreign policy, economy, and things like that. But today, let's do it slightly differently. When you look at Kazakhstan, you often look at pictures from Astana. You see a country that aspires to be perceived as, if not an economic superpower, then at least a country that is clearly heading for economic development, stability, prosperity. How does the situation look on the ground, though, beyond those promotional pictures, when we see lots of modern, sleek buildings and lots of greenery in the capital? What is the real picture there?
Well, of course, Astana, the capital, it's a very new capital to start with. I mean, it was just transferred from Almaty in the south to Astana in the north in the late 1990s. So they poured a lot of money into that. It is the pinnacle, I suppose, of what you could say of Kazakh architecture and economic might in the last 25 years. To some extent, that is reflected across the country. There are a lot of towns who have seen their infrastructure improved phenomenally, in the last 25 years, even all the way in the west on the Caspian Sea coast. Aktau, for instance, is a very modern-looking city with modern buildings now, and something of a boardwalk. They're trying to make it into something like the Turkish Riviera, and they've had some success with that. So there is some success. Now, of course, if you go out into the very hinterland in the middle of the country, and Kazakhstan's a very, very big country, right? Then you are going to find some areas, villages that really haven't seen much of the economic success that Kazakhstan's enjoyed in the last 25 or 30 years, certainly in the last 10 or 15 years. The living conditions are still a little bit primitive. There's still, for instance, running water, plumbing, things like that. There are places you can go to in Kazakhstan, and I've been to some of them, where you still have to, the toilet is still the outhouse that's a little bit away from your own house. But, generally, I think Kazakhstan, certainly more than the other Central Asian countries, has seen a trickle-down effect as far as the revenues coming into the country. Now, that said, of course, Kazakhstan has many, many resources and is in a much better position to make money than its Central Asian neighbors.
So a brand new capital, which in a way, at least in its philosophy, kind of reminds me of Turkmenistan as well, because there is a degree of ostentation, of strategic planning when it comes to the architecture, the overall appearance. It's supposed to reflect the ambition of the country's government, of its political elite. Would you say that this has been successful in the way that it was used to shape the country's image in general, both in the region and beyond?
I would have to say that they have been successful in some of this. The first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, really wanted to put Kazakhstan on the map and show that it was an international player. Now, obviously, Kazakhstan borders China to the east and Russia to the north, so they were never going to be competing on that kind of level. They would never have that kind of prominence in the international community that those two neighbors have. But Kazakhstan has gone a long ways to taking a place really on the international stage in a lot of things. Remembering that they were the host, the venue for Iranian nuclear talks, for instance, Syrian peace talks when those happened. They host a number of international conferences every year, including one on religious tolerance that draws all kinds of people to come. I mean, the Pope was there last year, right, for their international conference on religious tolerance. They've had other forums, on relations between the countries in Asia and confidence building measures. And that's also drawn major world leaders. India, the Indian Prime Minister has attended those. Former President Bill Clinton, he was already former president by that time, and he also attended one about 15, 16 years ago too. So, they have stepped up. Certainly, if you ask most people if they can name any Central Asian country, the one that they would probably be able to name is Kazakhstan. Now, again, it benefits a lot from its location, right? Especially in these days where we're talking about the Middle Corridor, the transit route that links China to Europe, and it goes through Central Asia. But Kazakhstan, borders China and also has a Caspian Sea port. So going through Kazakhstan means you only have to go through one country, whereas if you go further south, then you have to go through several countries before you get to the Caspian or transfer goods through Iran and over to Turkey. So Kazakhstan's taking a much more prominent position on the world stage now. It was already set up for that, but certainly now it is a much more important player, and a lot of countries are taking a very, very close look at Kazakhstan, not just in terms of transit, but also now in terms of critical raw materials. Kazakhstan is one of the top 10 oil exporting countries in the world. It is the top producer and exporter of uranium in the world. It's also one of the top 10 grain exporters in the world, too. So it's got a lot going for it.
So it has economic potential, it has the political prestige. What about cultural influence? Would you say that, in some way at least, the culture of Kazakhstan is able to radiate upon the other countries within Central Asia, that they might, at least to some extent, be trying to emulate its success? Or is it much more differentiated and therefore fragmented in this regard, with every country following its own path in terms of culture?
I would have to say the latter. Certainly all the other states to the south are envious of Kazakhstan's wealth, and they would like to have the kind of living conditions that Kazakhstan has. I mean, among the Commonwealth of Independent Countries, for instance, Kazakhstan has the second highest per capita income, right behind Russia. And if you look at where the Central Asians are on that per capita income list, they're far, far below it. I mean, Turkmenistan officially has about half of what Kazakhstan has, but it's actually even more it's lower than that. And most of the countries are less than 25% of the GDP compared to Kazakhstan. So, that while they might envy that, there's another factor that plays in here too, that relative to Central Asia, the Kazakhs are kind of a new people, right? They were a people of the steppe, horse riders. They didn't really build any structures because, of course, if you're a nomad, then you're moving all the time for your winter pastures, summer pastures, things like that. So there wasn't a lot left behind. The Kazakh nation traces itself back to the 15th century as an origin. But, to compare that to some of the other countries, the Tajiks have been around for 4 millennia. The Kyrgyz have been around for at least 2,000 years. So they have deeply entrenched cultures of their own, and even the Uzbeks, who are almost parallel to the Kazakhs in terms of their appearance, their ethnogenesis, and they've developed their own culture too. So there are some distinct differences between them. Even though they, like I said, they're envious of Kazakhstan's wealth and its success and its prominence on the international stage, which they don't enjoy. But in the same time, they are definitely proud of their own heritage and not looking to get anything transferred from Kazakhstan into their own countries.
Now, moving into politics, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has recently made a name for himself on a couple of occasions, trying to present himself as a leader that enjoys a degree of independence that is not going to be pushed around. There was this recent incident with Alexander Lukashenko trying to tell off Kazakhstan for not being supportive of Russia to this sufficient extent. He was diplomatically told to mind his own business, apparently. Would you say that Kassym-Jomart Tokayev really does enjoy a relatively independent position within the region? And to what extent would you say that he is still constrained by the framework of politics, meaning, of course, neighboring Russia, China, other influences there? To what extent can he carve his own path?
I think the way you put it was great. You phrased it because it really is a mixture here. Now, Kazakhstan has always tried to balance its foreign relations to the greatest degree possible. It has a lot of Western investment. The leading trade partner for Kazakhstan is the European Union, actually. there's a lot of American investment, which is not true of the other Central Asian states. Now, mostly that's going into the oil industry, right? They have huge oil fields in the West and in the Caspian Sea. So that's where a lot of that's gone. But that also has helped Kazakhstan to balance its position. It does neighbor China. It does neighbor Russia. They have to take that into consideration. They don't want to fall under the influence, too heavily under the influence of either one of those giant neighbors that it has. So they've tried to keep good ties with the West. They're courting better ties with the Arab world now and in the Middle East. They've managed to accomplish pretty good relations with Taliban-ruled Afghanistan under their own, too. Now, at the same time, of course, as you mentioned, there's a lot of pressure on them. Russia wants Kazakhstan to follow its lead. China wants Kazakhstan to follow its lead. And so these are things that the government has to take into consideration when it's trying to balance its own foreign policy. Certainly, and we've talked on this show before, Russia has really leaned on Kazakhstan a lot in the last few years and said some very chauvinistic things about Kazakhstan, and that maybe all the territory of Kazakhstan really doesn't belong to the Kazakhs at all, that it was settled by Russia, and by rights it should be historically considered to be part of Russia. The Chinese haven't been that vocal in this, but every now and then a map appears sometimes in school books in China that shows that at one time parts of Kazakhstan were part of China 2,000 years ago, part of the Chinese Empire. That worries the Kazakhs too. So when you're trying to court good ties with the West and at the same time not incur any hard feelings on the part of China and Russia, it's definitely a very, very tricky balancing act, which, to be fair, they've pulled off very well in Kazakhstan. And you mentioned specifically Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. He was the former foreign minister of Kazakhstan, so he might actually be the perfect person to be in power right now. He's very, very used to dealing with foreign issues and with foreign governments. I mean, he was working at the UN building for a while in Geneva. So he's certainly got great ties. He speaks 5 languages, one of which is Chinese, one of which is English, besides Russian, of course. So he's very capable, and certainly, what's the right word? He's got the ability anyway. And so far he's shown that he's able to pull this off and make clear that Kazakhstan's independent without going too far and making the other side, whoever it is, Russia, Belarus, China, whoever, angry about his comments.
So, from what you're saying, it would appear that Kassym-Jomart Tokayev actually does have what it takes to navigate this path between ambition, national pride, diplomacy, and the ability to sometimes follow the lead of the others, but sometimes most definitely basically show the way forward without looking at what the others have to say. Bruce Pannier was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for the invitation.
And now we're moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a curated selection of all the stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russia might have been short-sighted invading Ukraine in the first place, but now is making a prudent move, pulling out 90% of its aircraft beyond the range of ATACMS missiles that the US granted to Ukraine. Now, there is a small uncomfortable detail to this story. Let's take a look.
90% of Russia's aircraft has been moved outside the range of ATACMS missiles. Moscow's better safe than sorry move comes as Washington continues to block Ukraine from firing on Russia's homeland military infrastructure. Add the UK's long-range Storm Shadow missiles to this ban, and you have a move on the part of the West to avoid further military escalation. Is Russia's aircraft withdrawal a move in anticipation of Ukraine's breaking the West-imposed conditions? Moscow may actually be dreading Ukraine's latest creation, the Polonezia guided missile, boasting a range of 1,500 kilometers.
As Ukrainian forces drive the wedge deeper into Russia's Kursk region, Russian authorities say they would restrict entry to Kurchatov, the town where the Kursk nuclear plant is located.
The distance separating the Ukrainian forces from the Kursk nuclear power plant now amounts to about 50 kilometers. Moscow has blocked off the town of Kurchatov, with access allowed only to people registered as its citizens. People working in Kurchatov will have to present a permit issued by local authorities. Employees of the nuclear power plant will have to obtain entry permits from their employer. Checkpoints are to be set up, with civil servants issuing permits from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Russian leader Vladimir Putin last week accused Ukraine of attempting to attack the Kursk nuclear power plant. Kyiv denied the allegations.
It seems that the planned Chinese-Russian Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline is running out of gas as its power is being diminished by Mongolia's second thoughts regarding the financing of the project and Turkmenistan getting in with Beijing, an unexpected limitation to the ostensibly limitless Chinese-Russian relationship. More in this latest news report.
The Power of Siberia 2 is a planned gas pipeline that would carry 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year from Russia's Yamal region to China via Mongolia. But what Russian and Chinese officials deemed imminent a couple of months ago now hangs by a thread. This is owing to Mongolia's recent decision not to include funding for pipeline construction in the country's 5-year economic plan, a move interpreted as an indicator that China is rethinking the pipeline project. Should the enterprise be scrapped altogether, it would come as a downer for money-thirsty Russia at a time of gigantic spendings to keep its war in Ukraine going. The ditching of the project would not pain China, which may be eyeing Turkmenistan as its future provider of gas. In fact, Turkmenistan was outstripping Russia, being China's top gas supplier during the January-July period, exporting 5.10 billion euros in gas. Noteworthily, a group of Turkmen students has benefited this summer from a training course at the Petroleum University in Beijing.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.